The United States Navy commands the Persian Gulf with overwhelming force. Carrier strike groups project power across every nautical mile. Nuclear submarines patrol beneath the surface. Aegis destroyers track threats across hundreds of miles. No military on Earth can contest American naval dominance in these waters, Iran's entire defense. Budget equals what the Pentagon spends in roughly 3 weeks. Yet today Iran has effectively checkmated this supremacy. This isn't hyperbole. In recent months, Tehran has quietly activated what defense analysts are calling an energy trap, a strategic mechanism that transforms America's military advantage into a liability. The trap doesn't rely on matching U.S. firepower. It weaponizes something far more potent: the global economy's fundamental dependency on Persian Gulf oil flows. Here's the strategic paradox: every additional warship America deploys increases Iran's leverage rather than diminishing it. More military presence doesn't solve the problem, it potentially makes the situation worse, because this isn't about winning a naval battle. Iran has constructed a scenario where the battle itself becomes unthinkable, regardless of who would win. How does a regional power with aging military equipment create a situation where the world's dominant navy cannot effectively use its strength? The answer lies not in missiles or submarines, but in geography, energy infrastructure, and the hidden architecture of global oil markets. But here's what makes this different from every previous standoff in the Gulf. Iran isn't trying to win a military confrontation. They're trying to make one impossible to fight, and the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes they might have succeeded. To understand how Iran built this trap and why the U.S. Navy finds itself without effective counter-moves, we need to examine what actually happened in recent months and what most coverage has completely missed. Over the past 18 to 24 months, Iran has systematically intensified operations across multiple strategic domains. Naval exercises near the Strait of Hormuz have increased in frequency and complexity. The waterway funnels 21% of global petroleum liquids and roughly a third of seaborne liquefied natural gas. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' navy, which operates independently from the conventional navy, now conducts regular drills simulating closure scenarios. Simultaneously, Tehran has deepened coordination with Houthi forces in Yemen, who've demonstrated capacity to threaten Red Sea shipping lanes with drones and anti-ship missiles. Iran has expanded energy agreements with China that circumvent dollar-denominated payment systems, creating sanction-resistant revenue channels, and crucially, Tehran has coordinated with Russia on oil production strategies that amplify market volatility at strategically opportune moments. The key actors reveal the trap's complexity. Iran's Jiang operates fast attack craft and coastal missile batteries specifically designed for asymmetric Gulf warfare. China purchases Iranian oil despite sanctions, providing economic lifeline and political cover. Russia shares interests in elevated energy prices and weakened Western economic stability. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, maintains regional presence but faces operational constraints we'll examine shortly. While Persian Gulf tensions span decades, Iran's strategy has fundamentally shifted since 2022. Russia's invasion of Ukraine weaponized global energy markets, demonstrating how supply disruptions translate directly into economic and political pressure. Iran recognized an opportunity. Global oil markets remain tight despite recession fears. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve has been significantly drawn down. European energy security remains fragile after cutting Russian gas dependency. China's economic recovery depends on stable energy access. This confluence creates maximum leverage for anyone controlling critical choke points. Here's what makes this an energy trap specifically. Iran has constructed a scenario where threatening energy flows doesn't require actually stopping them. The threat alone creates market volatility, economic damage, and political pressure that constrains American options. The trap isn't sprung by military action, it's activated by creating credible risk that financial markets must price into every barrel of oil. On the surface, this looks like familiar Persian Gulf brinkmanship, but the strategic architecture Iran has built over the past 2 years represents something fundamentally different, and to understand why, we need to examine how we got here. The Strait of Hormuz has been a strategic flashpoint for decades, but Iran's approach has evolved from reactive defense to proactive economic warfare. That evolution didn't happen overnight. Iran's current strategy didn't emerge from abstract planning. It evolved through decades of hard-learned lessons about power vulnerability and the limits of military force. The foundation was laid during the Tanker War of 1984 to 1988, as the Iran-Iraq war ground on Tehran began attacking neutral oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, attempting to choke off Iraq's economic lifeline and international support. The campaign created genuine alarm. Global oil markets reacted, insurance rates spiked, and shipping companies demanded protection. Iran discovered that threatening energy flows generated immediate international attention and economic leverage. But they also learned the strategy's limits. The United States responded with Operation Earnest Will, reflagging Kuwaiti tankers under American protection and deploying naval escorts. U.S. forces systematically dismantled Iranian oil platforms being used for military purposes. In a single day, April 18, 1988, American forces sank or severely damaged half of Iran's operational navy. The lesson was unmistakable: in direct confrontation, Iran couldn't contest American naval power. The next crucial education came during the sanctions era from 2002 through 2015. International pressure over Iran's nuclear program created severe economic isolation. Cut off from global banking systems, unable to access frozen assets, watching their currency collapse, Iranian strategists studied financial architecture. The way military planners study terrain, they learned how the dollar-dominated system worked, where its pressure points were, and critically how to build alternatives. This period forced innovation: oil smuggling networks, ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, and cultivated relationships with buyers willing to circumvent sanctions. Simultaneously, Iran invested heavily in asymmetric military capabilities specifically designed for Gulf warfare: swarm boat tactics using fast attack craft, naval mine technology, anti-ship cruise missiles positioned along the Strait's narrow coastline, and crucially proxy relationships across the region: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq, and increasingly Houthi forces in Yemen. These weren't merely ideological alliances. They were strategic assets providing operational reach without direct Iranian fingerprints. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action represented a brief. Iran agreed to nuclear restrictions in exchange for sanctions relief and economic reintegration. For a moment, a different path seemed possible. Then came 2018. The U.S. withdrawal from the JPOA and reinstatement of maximum pressure sanctions fundamentally altered Iranian strategic calculations. Rather than weakening Tehran's resolve, the renewed isolation accelerated development of sanctions-resistant infrastructure, payment systems with China that bypassed SWIFT, entirely sophisticated oil smuggling operations, even cryptocurrency experiments. Iran was learning to operate outside the Western financial system. But two external events completed Iran's strategic education. In 2019, precision strikes hit Saudi Aramco facilities at Abqaiq and Quraysh, attacks widely attributed to Iran or its proxies. The strikes temporarily knocked out roughly 5% of global oil production. Markets reacted immediately, with prices spiking despite the supply disruption being resolved relatively quickly. Iran observed something crucial: the threat itself moved markets. Actual sustained supply interruption wasn't necessary; credible risk alone created economic impact. Then came 2022. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and subsequent weaponization of natural gas supplies to Europe provided a complete blueprint. Despite European condemnation of Russian aggression, energy dependency constrained military responses. Germany, reliant on Russian gas, initially hesitated on heavy weapons deliveries. European economies absorbed massive inflation rather than risk complete supply cutoff. Russia demonstrated that energy leverage could limit Western responses even to direct military aggression. For Iranian strategists, the lesson crystallized: control over energy flows or credible threat to them creates political constraints that conventional military power cannot overcome. Each of these developments taught Iran something crucial. But it wasn't until they combined these lessons into a unified strategy that the real trap emerged, one that exploits not just geography but the fundamental structure of how global energy markets actually work. Understanding this history reveals something most analysis misses: Iran isn't improvising. This is a carefully constructed strategy with multiple interlocking components, each designed to neutralize a specific American advantage. Iran's energy trap operates on four interlocking mechanisms that transform America's overwhelming military superiority into a strategic liability. The Strait of Hormuz narrows to just 21 miles at its tightest point. The navigable shipping lanes, constrained by traffic separation schemes and depth requirements, are barely 2 miles wide in each direction. Iran's coastline dominates the northern approach. Hardened missile positions overlook the waterway, concealed naval bases dot the coast. Fortified islands Abu Musa, the tons provide forward positions. The U.S. Fifth Fleet possesses overwhelming firepower to keep the strait open militarily. American destroyers, submarines, and carrier-based aircraft could suppress Iranian coastal defenses. Minesweepers could clear obstacles. In any direct confrontation, there's no question of military outcome. But here's the trap: Iran doesn't need to close the strait. They only need to create sufficient risk that insurance markets respond. Lloyd's of London and other marine insurers price war risk premiums based on threat assessment, not actual attacks. These premiums can multiply shipping costs several times over when underwriters perceive elevated danger. If Iran conducts aggressive naval exercises near shipping lanes, deploys naval mines, even inert ones discovered by tanker crews, or visibly positions mobile missile batteries along the coast, insurance markets react. When war risk premiums spike, shipping companies face a calculation, pay vastly higher insurance costs, reroute around Africa, adding weeks to journey time, or demand premium fees from customers. Each option raises the effective price of Gulf oil. Markets respond immediately. Futures contracts price in disruption risk, physical barrels become more expensive. Iran achieves economic disruption without firing a shot, and critically, U.S. military presence cannot prevent market psychology. You cannot bomb insurance actuaries into confidence. Naval superiority provides no leverage against risk perception. Iran has cultivated relationships with non-state actors controlling multiple strategic chokepoints, not just Hormuz. Houthi forces in Yemen can threaten the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, through which 8% of global trade passes between the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. Iranian-aligned militias in Iraq can strike regional pipelines, logistics hubs, and oil infrastructure. Hezbollah in Lebanon provides deterrent threat against Israeli or Saudi energy facilities. This creates a multi-front strategic problem. The U.S. Navy can protect Hormuz, but it cannot simultaneously secure Bab el-Mandeb, defend Saudi export terminals, protect way offshore facilities, and guard Iraqi pipeline infrastructure. The proxy network forces dispersion of American attention and resources while Iran maintains centralized strategic coordination. More importantly, proxy operations create attribution ambiguity that complicates responses. If Houthis strike a tanker in the Red Sea with an Iranian-supplied missile, does that justify striking Iran directly? The legal justification becomes murky. Domestic political support harder to secure, allied consensus more difficult to achieve. The ambiguity is deliberate strategic advantage, operational reach without direct accountability. Each proxy operates semi-independently, making the network resilient to disruption. Degrading Houthi capabilities doesn't eliminate the Iraqi militia threat. The system survives localized defeats. China purchases the majority of Iranian oil exports despite sanctions, using yuan-denominated transactions that bypass dollar-based financial systems. Alternative payment mechanisms, barter arrangements, cryptocurrency experiments in direct banking channels create sanctions-resistant revenue flows. This creates strategic depth Iran previously lacked. Any U.S. escalation that threatens Iranian oil exports directly impacts Chinese energy security. Beijing has explicitly signaled that stable energy access constitutes a core interest. This doesn't mean China would intervene militarily in a U.S.-Iran confrontation, but it creates powerful diplomatic constraints. If American actions spike oil prices or threaten supply stability, China possesses multiple economic retaliation options: increased pressure around Taiwan, rare earth export restrictions, semiconductor supply chain leverage, acceleration of dollar reserve diversification, or obstruction of U.S. interests in international institutions. Iran has essentially outsourced part of its strategic deterrence to China's economic interests. Washington must calculate not just Iranian military responses but Chinese economic and diplomatic reactions to any escalation. Every option becomes more complicated, the cost-benefit analysis less favorable. Here's the deepest level of the trap. Iran benefits from high oil prices even while operating under sanctions. Through smuggling networks, ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, flag of convenience registrations, and Chinese state company purchases, Iran still exports between 1 and 1.5 million barrels daily. When U.S. actions increasing Fifth Fleet presence, threatening strikes on Iranian facilities, or conducting freedom of navigation operations raise market tension, oil prices spike. Higher prices mean Iran's smuggled exports generate significantly more revenue. Sanctions enforcement actually becomes harder because expanded profit margins justify greater risk-taking by smugglers, intermediaries, and buyers. Meanwhile, elevated oil prices damage the U.S. economy, strain European allies already managing energy-driven inflation, and create domestic political vulnerabilities for Washington. American consumers see gas prices rise. Political opposition gains economic ammunition. Allied cohesion weakens under economic pressure. The paradox completes the trap. American military pressure generates precisely the market conditions that fund Iranian activities and strengthen Tehran's strategic position. These mechanisms don't operate independently, they reinforce each other. Geographic position creates initial leverage. Proxies multiply pressure points and complicate responses. China provides strategic depth that sanctions alone cannot penetrate. Market dynamics reward Iranian aggression while punishing American escalation. The U.S. Navy can win every tactical engagement but loses the strategic contest because military force doesn't address the actual mechanism of coercion. Destroying Iranian naval bases doesn't calm insurance markets. Eliminating proxy weapons stockpiles doesn't secure Chinese diplomatic cooperation. Increasing carrier presence might actually heighten market anxiety and drive prices higher. What most analysis fundamentally misses this isn't about comparing Iranian military capabilities against American power. It's about Iran fighting on strategic terrain, energy market psychology, and economic interdependence where U.S. military advantages provide no effective leverage. They've constructed a scenario where American strengths become irrelevant while weaknesses, alliance fragility, economic vulnerability to energy prices, global overextension become acutely exposed. This is where the trap becomes truly elegant. Every traditional American response either fails to address the actual mechanism of coercion or actively makes the problem worse, which raises the question, what are the actual consequences of this strategic checkmate? Understanding the trap's mechanics is one thing, but the implications extend far beyond the Persian Gulf. This represents a fundamental shift in how power operates in the 21st century. The immediate regional consequences reveal fractures in America's Middle East architecture that have been decades in the making. Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the Kuwait built their modern foreign policies on a fundamental bargain alignment with Washington in exchange for security guarantees, but the Iranian strategic trap exposes a critical limitation in that arrangement. American military power can prevent invasion. It can deter armed attack. What it cannot do is prevent economic disruption. And for rentier states whose entire governance models depend on stable energy revenue, that distinction matters profoundly. This recognition is already reshaping regional diplomacy. The Saudi-Iran normalization agreement brokered by China in March 2023 wasn't merely about reducing tensions. It reflected a strategic recalculation in Riyadh. If the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet cannot guarantee stable energy markets despite its overwhelming presence, why maintain exclusive alignment with Washington? The answer increasingly is hedging, developing relationships with Beijing, engaging Tehran, directly diversifying security partnerships beyond traditional American channels. This doesn't mean abandoning Washington, but it fundamentally undermines the bilateral security architecture that has structured the Gulf since the Carter Doctrine of 1980. For Israel, the implications are equally significant but more direct. Iran's energy leverage now constrains how aggressively the United States can support Israeli military action against Iranian nuclear facilities or regional proxy networks. Every calculation about striking Natanz or interdicting weapons shipments to Hezbollah must now include an assessment of potential oil market disruption. Washington must weigh Tehran's potential response not just in military terms, missile retaliation, proxy attacks, but in economic ones. Will this push crude past $120 per barrel? What does that do to inflation, to consumer confidence, to midterm election prospects? This injects an economic brake into alliance commitments that were previously evaluated primarily on strategic grounds. It's a fundamental shift in the dynamics between Washington and Tel Aviv. But the regional consequences, significant as they are, represent only the beginning. Globally, Iran's approach provides something far more dangerous, a replicable blueprint for constraining American power. The lesson isn't build aircraft carriers or develop fifth-generation fighters, capabilities that required decades and hundreds of billions of dollars. The lesson is far simpler: identify structural dependencies where geography, economics, or market psychology create leverage that conventional military superiority cannot address. Find the place where your opponent's strength becomes irrelevant. China is studying this intensely. If Iran can checkmate the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf, the exact scenario American naval power is designed to prevent. What does that imply for Washington's ability to enforce a blockade around Taiwan while simultaneously managing the economic fallout? Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors and 90% of the most advanced chips. Any conflict that disrupts that supply creates a global economic crisis that makes oil disruption look manageable by comparison. Beijing doesn't need to win a naval battle in the Philippine Sea, it needs to make the economic cost of American intervention unacceptable to voters in Phoenix and Pennsylvania. Russia has already internalized this logic. European dependence on Russian natural gas wasn't an accident of geology, it was cultivated strategically over decades, creating exactly the kind of leverage that conventional military power struggles to counter. Turkey controlling the Bosporus and Dardanelles, the sole access points to the Black Sea, is taking notes on weaponizing maritime chokepoints. Venezuela observes Iran's sanctions evasion networks and alternative payment systems with great interest. Economically, Iran's strategy weaponizes something more subtle than actual supply disruption. It weaponizes uncertainty itself. Even without closing the strait or mining shipping lanes, the credible threat of disruption maintains what traders call a geopolitical risk premium. Estimates suggest Persian Gulf tensions alone add $5 to $10 per barrel to oil prices, not because supply is actually constrained, but because the possibility of constraint must be priced into markets. This functions as a continuous economic tax on global growth, particularly damaging to energy-importing economies in Europe and Asia. For Europe, already destabilized by Russian gas supply disruptions following the Ukraine invasion, this represents a compounding vulnerability. For the United States, persistently elevated energy prices feed directly into inflation, constraining Federal Reserve policy options and creating domestic political pressure that limits foreign policy flexibility. When gasoline hits $4 per gallon, presidential approval ratings drop and congressional appetite for foreign commitments evaporates. Iran understands this connection perfectly. Militarily, the situation exposes uncomfortable limitations in American conventional dominance. The U.S. defense establishment has spent decades optimizing for high-end warfare, peer conflict with China deterring Russian tank columns in Europe. These scenarios assume that military capability translates directly into strategic advantage. Iran demonstrates what happens when adversaries shift the battlefield to economic interdependence and market psychology domains where aircraft carriers and stealth bombers provide limited utility. It raises questions that Pentagon planners would prefer not to answer. Is the Navy's $230 billion annual budget optimized for threats that increasingly don't involve naval combat? Are carrier strike groups the right tool when the actual battlefield is insurance markets and energy trading desks? Diplomatically, perhaps the most significant implication is what Iran's success reveals about declining American economic coercion. Tehran built this strategic trap while under maximum pressure sanctions, the most comprehensive economic warfare campaign the United States has ever waged, yet Iran developed alternative payment systems, adopted cryptocurrency for sanctions evasion, negotiated bilateral currency agreements including yuan-rial oil trading, and constructed networks that operate outside dollar-dominated financial architecture. This suggests that a parallel international economic system is emerging, one where dollar dominance and swift access matter less than Washington previously assumed, and that erosion affects far more than Iran policy. It undermines America's most powerful non-military tool of statecraft across every theater and every adversary. These consequences are already unfolding, but they raise the most critical question: what can actually be done about this? And more importantly, what happens next? For Washington, the strategic dilemma is profound. Traditional responses don't work, and doing nothing allows the trap to deepen, which leaves several possible futures, none of them simple. The strategic trap Iran has constructed doesn't resolve itself. It's there, a persistent feature of the geopolitical landscape waiting for someone to make the next move. Understanding where this leads requires examining the realistic options available to the key actors, the constraints they face, and the logic driving their decisions. The first scenario involves managed coexistence through deliberate de-escalation. In this pathway, Washington recognizes that military options don't address the trap's fundamental mechanism and pursues diplomatic engagement, potentially reviving nuclear negotiations, but with a different focus, rather than exclusively about centrifuges and enrichment levels. Talks would center on establishing stable energy market management. The implicit understanding would be straightforward: Iran moderates threatening behavior around the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for sanctions relief that allows normalized oil exports and integration into global energy markets. The logic is compelling for both sides. Iran gains what it has sought for years: economic normalization, access to international banking, the ability to sell oil openly rather than through sanctions evasion networks. The United States removes a persistent source of market volatility and geopolitical risk, China heavily dependent on Gulf energy supplies, would support this outcome enthusiastically. European states eager to stabilize energy markets after the disruptions from Russian supply cuts would back diplomatic resolution. But the challenges are formidable. Domestic American politics make meaningful engagement with Tehran extraordinarily difficult. Any agreement faces fierce opposition in Congress, and the political capital required is substantial. Israel and Gulf Arab states would oppose sanctions relief, viewing it as empowering a regional adversary. And most critically, Iran itself may calculate that it has more leverage maintaining the trap than dismantling it. Why give up a strategic advantage that constrains American action across the region? The probability of this scenario is moderate at best, and it requires political will that Washington may simply not possess. The second scenario is incremental escalation and testing, and it most closely resembles the current trajectory. In this pathway, Iran continues probing American responses with incrementally aggressive actions, naval maneuvers near Hormuz that come closer to commercial shipping, proxy attacks on energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. Or the way with plausible deniability, periodic disruptions that spike oil prices just enough to demonstrate leverage without triggering overwhelming retaliation. Washington responds with targeted strikes on proxy capabilities, increased sanctions enforcement, and enhanced naval presence, but carefully avoids direct strikes on Iranian territory due to escalation risks. This becomes a new normal. Not peace, not war, but persistent low-level conflict that maintains a risk premium on oil markets without triggering full-scale confrontation. Both sides avoid the costs of major escalation while pursuing limited objectives. Iran maintains economic pressure on the United States and its allies. Washington demonstrates resolve and supports regional partners without committing to an unwinnable escalation spiral. Neither side wins decisively. Both accept a chronic state of tension as preferable to the alternatives. The challenges here involve miscalculation and accidents. Proxy forces operating with some independence might strike targets that cause significant civilian casualties, creating domestic pressure in the United States or allied countries that demand stronger responses. An Iranian naval vessel might misjudge distances during harassment maneuvers and actually collide with American warships. Intelligence failures could attribute an attack to Iran that was actually conducted by another actor. Any of these could trigger escalation neither side genuinely wants. Yet this scenario carries high probability precisely because it represents the path of least resistance. Neither Washington nor Tehran has strong incentives to deviate dramatically from the current pattern. It's manageable if unsatisfying. The third scenario involves strategic decoupling through energy transition acceleration. Here the United States and its allies recognize they cannot solve the Iran problem militarily and focus instead on reducing vulnerability by diminishing Persian Gulf oil dependency. This means rebuilding strategic petroleum reserves, investing massively in renewable energy and domestic production, helping Europe diversify away from Middle Eastern suppliers, and expanding nuclear power generation. The timeline is long, 10 to 15 years, but Iran's leverage diminishes progressively as dependency decreases. The logic is sound. This approach solves the structural dependency that creates Iranian leverage in the first place. China faces similar incentives to diversify energy sources, reducing systemic risk to its economy. Renewable energy technology continues improving while costs decline, making transition increasingly feasible. But the challenges are equally clear. Energy transition is expensive and politically contentious, touching everything from labor markets to regional economies dependent on fossil fuel industries. The timeline is far too long to address the immediate strategic problem, and global oil markets remain deeply interconnected regardless of American consumption patterns. Disruption in the Gulf affects prices worldwide, even if the United States imports nothing from the region. This scenario is highly likely as a long-term trend driven by climate policy and technological change as much as geopolitical strategy, but it doesn't address the near-term problem. The fourth scenario sees Iran's energy trap become fully integrated into broader US-China competition. Beijing moves beyond tacit support to explicit backing of Tehran's position, making any American pressure on Iran a direct issue in US-China relations. This could involve expanded Chinese naval presence in the Persian Gulf, formal security agreements, or even defense commitments. China secures reliable energy access while constraining American freedom of action in the Middle East, forcing Washington to manage simultaneous challenges across multiple theaters. Early indicators of this pathway already exist. Chinese warships make port calls in Iran. Economic integration deepens. But full implementation would represent a major strategic expansion for Beijing, extending security commitments far beyond current capabilities and drawing China into regional conflicts it has historically preferred to avoid. The probability is moderate to high over a 5 to 10-year timeframe, though significant obstacles remain. The most likely outcome isn't any single scenario, but rather a combination, primarily incremental escalation becoming normalized while slow structural changes reduce dependency, persistent tension without resolution. Neither decisive victory nor definitive defeat, just a chronic condition that both sides manage rather than solve. Each scenario presents different risks and opportunities, but they all share one common feature: the era of unchallenged American dominance in the Middle East has definitively ended. The question is what replaces it, which brings us back to the fundamental question: what does Iran's energy trap tell us about power itself in the 21st century? Iran's energy trap reveals something profound about 21st century geopolitics. Conventional military dominance, while still important, no longer guarantees strategic advantage. The United States Navy can destroy any opponent in naval combat control sea lanes globally, project overwhelming power across any ocean, and yet find itself strategically checkmated by an adversary that never challenges American forces directly. This isn't a failure of military capability, it's a fundamental shift in how power operates. In an interconnected global economy where energy flows, financial systems, and supply chains create profound mutual dependencies, strategic leverage increasingly comes from controlling the dependencies themselves rather than controlling territory or winning battles. Iran understood something essential: you don't need aircraft carriers. If you can weaponize the geography through which energy must flow, you don't need a stronger military if you can make your opponent's military power irrelevant to the actual contest. This pattern extends far beyond the Persian Gulf. China's Belt and Road Initiative creates infrastructure dependencies across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Russia weaponizes natural gas pipelines, turning energy supplies into geopolitical leverage. Turkey uses refugee flows as diplomatic pressure against European states. These aren't military strategies, they're structural strategies that render military responses ineffective or counterproductive. The great irony is that America's overwhelming conventional military superiority may have inadvertently encouraged adversaries to innovate precisely in those domains where that superiority provides no advantage. The energy trap isn't just about oil tankers or insurance premiums. It's about the emerging architecture of power in a multipolar world where interdependence itself becomes a weapon, where economic coercion rivals military force in strategic importance, and where geographic chokepoints matter as much as carrier strike groups. Iran didn't build a better navy, they built a better trap, and the American Navy, for all its extraordinary power, has no clear way to escape it. The question isn't whether America can still win naval battles in the Persian Gulf. It's whether naval battles represent the right measure of power anymore, and whether dominance in yesterday's warfare matters when adversaries are already fighting tomorrow's conflicts.